Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Bookshelf, which is a podcast series that is brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. And in this podcast, we chat with authors about their books on South Asian politics, economy, and society. My name is Rajni Gamage. I'm a research fellow at the Institute. So today we are discussing the book titled Performing Sovereign Aspirations, Tamil Insurgency and Postwar Transition in Sri Lanka, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. Just a few words about the book before we introduce the author. The book adopts a performative perspective to understand the peculiar institutional landscape that followed the Tamil separatist conflict in Sri Lanka, both during and after the Civil War. And it draws on 2 decades of fieldwork in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, ethnography within Sri Lanka's public service, and access to the Norway-facilitated peace process. And to discuss the book, we are fortunate to have its author, Dr. Bart Klem, who is a professor at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies from Ghent University in Belgium. So Bart, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rajni. Good day to you.
Right. So first of all, I want to thank you for writing this book. And I'm not saying that lightly. I think I mentioned it to you that reading the book, it felt quite light, which is refreshing in terms of reading an academic book, although the content was, of course, very complex and personal and heavy in another aspect. So I read it a couple of times, and I really, really liked some of the methodological aspects you took through, and the narrative was it had a great momentum to it. So I just wanted to congratulate you on it.
Thank you.
Right. And so to start off, perhaps maybe we could start with giving the listeners the basic premise or the problem that you were seeking to unpack within the book.
Thank you. It took me a long time to answer that question, actually, but I'll try and give you a quick answer now. So when I was a master's student in 2000, so this is a little while ago, I went to do fieldwork in eastern Sri Lanka near Trincomalee, and that involved going into areas that were then under the control of the LTTE, the Tamil militancy. And I entered a place that seemed like a state. There was a boundary, and there was an area where the LTTE were effectively in charge and running, all kinds of affairs. And so what do we make of that? Like, what is that? And that basic dilemma came back again and again. So a couple of years later, I was a little bit more senior. I was involved in writing the conflict research, the conflict assessment for several donors, together with Jonathan Goodhand. And he asked me to write a couple of paragraphs about the LTTE. I was like, okay, I had developed some experience. I thought I knew a bit about it. And trying to write that up, I realized that I didn't have the right words, because in our everyday language, but also in academic terms, particularly the verbs, also the nouns, but mainly the verbs, they force us to decide right at the bat, are we applying this thing to a state or a non-state? So do we call it taxation, state, or extortion, mafia? Do we call it legislation, or do we call it racketeering? All kinds of things that the state does have special verbs. So when you deal with an entity that is a bit like a state, but maybe not quite, it's not just about what you call that entity, it's everything that it does or needs a kind of word. And of course, there are ways around that. You can use scare quotes, you can use prefixes, pseudo or proto or something else, to hint, this is a state, but maybe not quite. People get that intuitively, but at the same time, it fudges the basic problem. How do we understand these entities that sort of sit between state and non-state? And it's not just analytical, right? There's normative and moral issues with that. Like, by calling it state-like or by depicting it state-like, you give it a certain degree of legitimacy, a certain grandiose proportion. And you may or may not want to do that. And when I moved on, I started working in Melbourne, and I started talking to some colleagues, and I met somebody who worked on Northern Ireland. And some of the things that I described, I realized were not unique to Sri Lanka. Like what happened in the Irish question and Sinn Féin and different entities related to that faced similar issues. So I realized I was onto something a little bit bigger. Long story short, the basic problem that the book tries to confront is, how do we describe and understand entities and movements that present themselves as state, that aspire to be sovereign, but are not widely recognized as such and don't have the legal foundations to be that. What's the right way to approach that? If we call them states, we maybe give them too much credit and people misunderstand the picture because there's a lot of anxiety and stuff. If we don't call them state, we sort of sell them short. So is there another way?
Right. And I mean, I'm going to draw a few quotes from your book because a lot of it was quite evocative. Just to follow up on what you were saying, in terms of the fundamental problem that you were trying to unpack within the book, and then this problem of categorization that you raise within it. So just briefly to quote from you, you say that because on the one hand, you try to attempt to represent effective institutions as what they're supposed to be. So there's that attempt on the one hand, and that's based on legal underpinnings, what constitutions mean and all of that. But that leads to a misleading sort of picture. But then on the other hand, when you describe institutions that say insurgent movements such as the LTT try to prop up as what they claim to be, then a lot of these aspirations are projected in propaganda, and that too leads to a misleading rendition. And so you say this normative question that you raised, that both of these approaches raise moral dilemmas around the effects of categorization. And so this idea of how it's such a tricky problem of categorizing, like you said, what these verbs are in terms of the performance of what it means to be a state or act like a state, that came up throughout your book. So I thought to ask you a question on that. Can we really avoid categorization? And why is it such a problematic kind of space to be in?
Very good question indeed. No, we cannot avoid categorization, right? Because we use words and words categorize. But we can be more reflective about the categories that we use. And my sort of lingering frustration or the sort of challenge that I had with a whole bunch of writing, much of it is very good, on civil wars, on separatist movements, on independence groups, etc., was that it used what I thought is quite clunky language around that. So yes, of course, I use categories too, but the central point of the perspective that I take, a performative perspective, as you hinted at already, is that there are categories, but it's always clear that categories are something that's enacted and therefore contingent. So whether or not it really is that is always the question. And because it is unclear, we see all the things that we see. But we'll get back to that in a second. But that basic challenge of sort of hovering categories, like it's like this now, and they get away with it, but maybe not for very long. So that basic challenge always remains, and it allows you to move in that in-between space between taking a purely legal perspective, like what is this formally supposed to be, and taking whatever people say for granted, both of which are really problematic, right? If you go up to the money in 2000, you cross the front line and you run into these LTTE customs officers. If you take a legal perspective, you don't see anything. There's nothing there. There are terrorists or rebels or whatever word you want to use who've dressed up as customs and say they are that, but they're not that, and there's nothing there to be seen. Right. That kind of misses the point, because if you take that perspective and you fly to Taiwan, there's no state, right? Legally speaking, Taiwan does not exist. I mean, depending on whom you ask, of course, right? But many of these de facto entities, Northern Cyprus, Somaliland, the Dalai Lama, have certain claims that have a problematic legal foundation. It's not straightforward. And if you take an overly formalistic perspective, you're not understanding what you see. So that's a problem. And at the same time, of course, you don't want to just take at face value whatever people claim, because there's many movements out there, including the LTTE, that claim things that are not quite credible or wrong or problematic. So we need to find a space in between where what is being presented, to what degree does that have also credence among the audience? Do people buy it? And that's very subtle. Which people buy it? Which audience? Is it the local audience, the international audience? To what degree? How far can they stretch it? And when do they suddenly fall over? A particular performance can look very credible and validating and powerful. And if you do the same thing in a different situation or a year later, you look like a fool. So these things are therefore contingent. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, this is something I do want to ask a bit later onwards in terms of the contingency of legitimacy and to what extent the performance of the state contributes to it versus things that might escape this performativity of the state. But before that, both of us, I mentioned as well that your book brings on this performative perspective as a lens to understand the attempts by the LTT, as well as certain other focal points that you bring into in the various chapters in terms of sovereignty or enforcing sovereignty and all of that. So perhaps for the listeners, could you help to describe what the key tenets of a performance perspective are and what kind of analytical value does it add to the discourse?
Yes. Of course, there's a rather massive literature on this. I didn't come up with this. I did some work in applying it, but the basic idea of performativity goes back a long way. It traces in anthropology, but you also find it in gender studies, of course, and across political science, IR, geography. So there's a lot of people who have worked with this. So when I go visit my family-in-law, I am me, but I am a particular version of me. And when I hang out with my friends, or when I talk to my kids, or when I teach a class in the university lecture hall, I am me, but I'm a particular version of me. So I perform a version of me. Now, one could argue in a very simple sense that there's a true me in me, but when I go out, then I perform. Now, at the present moment, I am in fact performing, right?
Yes.
But ultimately, if you push that argument a bit further, you realize, well, there isn't a sort of real core me. All there is are these performances, which interrelate, because through performing, I become who I am from very early childhood. When you learn to play, when you learn to speak, you're doing stuff, you're performing, which then either gets replicated, get encouraged or discouraged, and it changes you. So there's not a sort of true actor in me which performs. There's all these performances that shape who I am. This is true for many things in the world, and it's true for politics. So you can look at elections and say, okay, this is very simple, it's very rational. People look at policies and preferences and they vote, and then they create the composition of parliament or of whichever council they're voting for. That's true. Legally speaking, that's exactly what it is. But if that's what it is, why do we see all the things that we see? Right? If in election time, I don't know Singapore well enough, but across South Asia, you see posters, all kinds of excitement, stuff on the street, music, people getting really fired up, lots of stuff around colors and pasting all kinds of stuff across the streets, all kinds of stuff that happens that has quite little to do with sort of sensible policy making. There are electorates where it's already clear who's going to win because that party always wins. And yet there is all this stuff. For rational reasons, it doesn't need to happen. But from a performative perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It's about claiming space. It's about proportioning or sort of projecting a particular narrative. It's about claiming particular charisma. There's rituals. There's sort of things that make people feel excited and powerful. There's the speeches. There's the insults. There's the mockery. None of that has any sort of policy traction, but it's all there. So to understand politics, a performative perspective is helpful. We can think of a few big leaders on the world stage at the moment who are very much into performance, right? I don't need to go into those details. A lot of that has to do with claiming a particular posture. And if you look at it in a sort of theatrical sense, it makes a lot more sense than when you look at it from a sort of policy governance lens. Gender studies, of course, has worked on this a lot, because what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be queer, etc.? A lot of that is an interaction between body, biology perhaps, but also interaction on the social level and the performance of yourself. So who you perform yourself to be is in many ways who you in fact are. Applied to the kind of issues that I'm working on, this is a very helpful lens because it allows us to bracket my true me, the Constitution, what things formally are, and look instead at how things are enacted, how are they performed. And that creates space for the LTTE, for Tamil nationalists, but also for the Naxalites, or for the Naga people, or for Polisario in Western Sahara, or for the Catalonian independence movement. Because they all operate in a space where the formal strictures of the law, but also of the democratic arena, sort of mismatch what they're trying to do. and yet they do all kinds of things. So a very simple example. You can run elections as if they were a referendum. By doing that, it doesn't become a referendum. Legally speaking, they're elections. But if you as a party say, I'm going to participate in these elections, I'm very apprehensive about the council that I'm running for, but I'm going to participate. And if you vote for me, that means you favor independence. And if 80% of your constituency, say 80% of the Tamils or 80% of the Catalans or 80% of the Kurds, vote for you, the democratic message of that is, in fact, that 80% of that constituency supports independence, which is kind of what a referendum does. So, from a foreign perspective, this is wrong. It's an election, and people can blah, blah, blah all they like, but you voted for this person, that person is going to be in the legislature, done and dusted. There was never a referendum. But by enacting it like a referendum, it kind of becomes one. And that creates political forces that people have to relate to, that they have to do something about, that they can't completely ignore. An electoral boycott is another example. There's elections, you boycott it, okay, fine. If you don't participate, no big deal, somebody else will do it. But that's not quite it. An electoral boycott is a lot more than not participating. It's not just a void. It does things. Now, an electoral boycott isn't the thing. Legally speaking, it doesn't exist. There is no sort of, you can't say, oh, that's what I'll do. Yeah. And yet it happens. So you perform a boycott, and it has all kind of democratic, political, other consequences. Now, in all those cases, a performative perspective allows you to open a sort of conceptual middle ground between what things formally are, which matters, but it doesn't define everything, and what they are claimed to be, which matters, but also doesn't completely define the truth. So I hope that sort of sketches where I'm trying to go with this.
Right. I mean, very much so. I think when reading your book, the perspective really helped to draw out these nuances that you were saying, the things that might formally not mean to matter. I mean, they do matter in the sense that how the LTT as an insurgency movement, how it, or as a liberation movement, how its actions, even if they don't formally constitute certain categories that we would define, especially within, say, the legal tradition or the political science traditions. The impact that they have do even impact these formal structures, even if I was to come from that angle. So they matter by themselves, but they also matter in that they affect or impact very much these formal structures and the lived realities of people. But this was a bit of a question I had, and I understand it's also coming from my political science kind of mindset, which is that how much does the performativity or performance, like that lens of approaching a situation, how comfortably or how well does it complement power? Because you do very well, I think, raise this issue of how power functions within normal politics, in quotes, which is that in our everyday politics, we have so much of violence and transgressions, but they are still considered as operating within the framework of the state and operating within the framework of sovereignty. So you do raise that very much, but then I was wondering how much does performance, yes, it draws out the nuances and the micro very well, but how much of it can we scale to a structural level, and how comfortably does it sit alongside the asymmetries of power? Is that clear, or should I?
Yeah, no, it is.
Yes.
It was complicated to ask the question. It's a bit more complicated to give a good answer.
Right.
But the basic point is that state, non-state, power, no power are very different dichotomies. So a performative perspective doesn't mean that it's soft, or that it's not about power, or that it's just a subaltern trying to do something against the powerful state. States also perform. In fact, they perform all the time. If people get elected as president, they immediately start acting presidentially, because that's what people expect them to do, and that's what they themselves expect them to do. So that's not a power-free space where they perform. That's a performance that is endowed with power. It's also not a space free of violence. So violence itself can be highly performative. The Twin Towers was in terms of military damage, a very minor attack, but in terms of performative impact, it was huge. Right. So the violence itself is, and this is particularly true for asymmetrical use of violence. Violence itself is a performative act as well as other things, and violence can erase certain performances. So you can powerfully stage a public dissent movement. And the fact that you're there on the street doing it is, the stuff that's happening in Iran at the moment, or name any country really. The stuff that's happened in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka recently, your very interesting conference earlier this week. Very performative. And then when the state crushes it, the police comes in, thugs come in, that's itself also a takeover of the stage, which has performative consequences. So it's not that you need to decide, am I going to do performance, wishy-washy, theatrical, creative stuff, or I'm going to do power and violence. No, they're both connected. So the performative has limits, and those are shaped by the structural forces that you refer to, the structures of power that underpin them. One example of that is that in the early stages of the peace process that was facilitated by Norway in the early 2000s, the LTTE went to town, right? For suddenly they were no longer just this pariah group that only a few people in Tamil Nadu felt was legitimate. Suddenly they were hosted by the Norwegians. They were wearing suits. They were flying around the world. They were giving press conferences. This was, they were going to make it. They were going to promote themselves and get upgraded to the echelon of powers of states. Mm-hmm. And not long after that, the peace process derailed. But the LTTE continued doing its exact same performance. But the consequence of it were the opposite. So in the first year or two of the peace process, it had a sort of wow effect for many Tamils, like, oh my God, look at what they're doing, in a positive or a negative way, of course, depending on whom you ask. And there was a lot of international attention. A lot of the European diplomats were really interested and very keen to sort of see what they could do and be constructive. And then, of course, things derailed. Different kind of bans came in. The peace process went off the rails as well. Violence erupted in the regions. And it was a very different equation. The LTTE persisted in its performance. It presented the ISGA, this interim self-governing authority proposal, and it continued to enact itself as a sort of proto-state with diplomats that were bargaining for peace. But the audience had completely changed. And some people simply ignored them. Other people were suddenly really anxious, particularly in New Delhi. And it had the sort of opposite effect of undercutting itself. So it wasn't the sort of applauding, hoo-ha, look at them. It had the complete opposite effect. Now, the reason it had the opposite effect has, of course, everything to do with power. Mm-hmm. The powerful actors had shifted. The Americans were playing along initially, and now they were kind of fed up. India had sort of kept silent, and now it was much more vocal about being really worried about where this was going. European actors who were constructive were now sort of muted. So the audience had changed, and therefore the exact same performance, or the continuation of the same performance, had complete opposite effect. It no longer mesmerized anybody. It raised concern. It raised panic even. And to some degree, that created the constellation that ultimately led to the defeat of the LTTE. Mm-hmm. So power and violence are not a separate space. They're caught up with performative action.
Right. I mean, I'd like to pick up from here because this was a question I had based on chapter 3, so I'm jumping a bit ahead. But you're talking in context of the peace talks that were facilitated by Norway in the early 2000s and how there was conflict within the central government to a large extent, which also contributed to the derailment of the peace talks. Then, like you mentioned, these external factors like the proscription of the LTTE in many Western countries, India's stance on it. And within this equation, I was also wondering to what extent. So, I mean, just to give some context, which is that the LTTE and the government enter into peace talks, but from what you describe, it pans out that there was more interest in this performance of each of their interests rather than reaching a compromise, and the kind of lack of flexibility on both sides as well leads to this breakdown of talks. So I was wondering if, I don't know how this question is going to sound, but in terms of how much of capacity did the LTTE have to transform from the version that they were in the early 2000s to a much more formidable entity that could kind of, again, transform from that to, I wouldn't say state, because it's a process of becoming. Would you say that it was also the lack of that capacity then which prevented it from making that transformation? In which case, again, so these questions of performativity and power, because you can perform to a large extent, but if you lack the capacity, then the translation does not really happen? And then it relies, yes, on the audience as well. But how much can we account for the lack of capacity within that particular space to convert?
So my book doesn't really answer that question, but I have some ideas on it. So the LTTE, of course, was ultimately a movement headed by Prabhakaran, who was a very particular person with very particular views. But if you take the Tamil nationalist movement more broadly, I think they were part of that movement that were genuinely interested in transforming into some form of sovereign entity, whether fully independent or otherwise, and that the performative attempts to pretend to enact themselves as a sort of a Tamil state or an otherwise independent state with a degree of democratic legitimacy, etc., I think were genuine and hypothetically could have transformed themselves into a state of sorts. We've seen other cases where this happened. I do some work on Northern Cyprus, different place. But sometimes I wonder if the LTTE and Delhi hadn't clashed the way they did. Whoever is responsible for that, another question. But rather they had kept India as a patron, the way that Turkey is a patron for Northern Cyprus. Maybe northeastern Sri Lanka would have looked a bit like Northern Cyprus. Right. Would that have been a good thing? Is a really complicated question, right? There's a lot of different versions to that. Northern Cyprus is not at all a paradise. And of course, there's many other people who weren't happy about it. But it's an open question. So maybe something like that could have happened. Switching repertoires is very difficult for these movements. So we saw that after the war, when this very well-honed repertoire that the LTTE in particular had, Tamil nationalism, but also martyrdom, suicide cadres, sacrifice, the leader, all these kinds of things, suddenly got in the way, right? Because the main currency in the immediate aftermath of the war, it shifted away from Sri Lanka because there was no space. So to Geneva, to other places. And suddenly the language in which Tamil arguments had to be phrased were about human rights. The Talaivar, the leader, and suicide cadres are not helpful if you're trying to make a human rights claim, right? So suddenly they had to reorient themselves, and you could see them struggle, and they could see them go off the rails because, waving LTTE flags is not a helpful thing when you're trying to make a claim about, state genocide. So this would have been, in a very different way, equally complicated had the LTTE transformed itself into a state of sorts.
Right.
Responsibility towards the Muslims, dealing with the Sinhalese who live in the Northeast, basic claims of rights, basic questions of governance, all these kinds of things would have come in. So it would have been really complicated. I'm not so sure. I think the LTTE was extremely fixed in its ideology and in its approach. Prabhakaran in particular did not deal well with dissent. It never really developed a political wing in the way that other movements have. So I'm skeptical. The sort of tragedy of the Tamil nationalist movement, I think, is that it started with statesmen, Chelvanayakam, others, well-educated, mostly sensible people, and it then got hijacked by the youth for understandable reasons. But those two things never balanced out again. I digressed a bit, but I think that's I wasn't convinced that the LTTE would transform in that way, but it's thinkable. What happened in 2001, 2, 3, 4? I think is, yes, the basic analysis that you gave, the parties were not prepared to compromise, neither the government nor the LTTE, and therefore it didn't get anywhere. Of course, that's true, I think. But that's also, in some ways, not a critic to you, but it's in some ways a superficial analysis, because why was that the case? And the more I thought of the peace process, the more I felt that the dominant interpretation of that peace process is in some ways a misunderstanding. So, and it's to do with the temporal delimitation. So if you read the Wikipedia or a quick sort of summary of that period, the story is that the peace process started in 2002, something like that, maybe 2001 if they're generous. Then it went well because there were 6 rounds of talks and they just explored federalism in Oslo and these kinds of things. And then it went off the rails because it was too difficult. But many people know when Norway got involved, 91, a lot earlier, right? Not as a formal player, but in trying to play a role. It then also got accepted as a role by Kumaratunga, the president. And there was a long pre-run. So in some ways, in my view, and it's not because I'm such a fan of Chandrika Kumaratunga, he's a problematic character too, right? But she had a vision of peace, and she had both in terms of what she wanted to get out of it, which was not completely, devolution. Neelam Tirichelvan's ideas there were ideas with merit, whether you agree with that or not. And she had an idea about process, both in terms of LTTE government actors locally and in terms of what kind of international consultation. So it was thought about. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who became the prime minister after he capsized Chandrika's government, did not have that. It's not because I don't like him, which I don't. Not many people do at the moment, but there was no vision about what kind of peace. There was no vision about process. There was no vision about the international constellation. It was just all a sideshow. So looking at that, the whole picture changes because the peace process happened between 97 and 99, behind closed doors, with the Norwegians trying very hard to do all the preliminary work with a certain degree of vision. All kinds of preliminary things get agreed on, even if the war is still going on. There's a vision about how we're going to get there. There's an idea about the outcome, not independence, but devolution, genuine, not the hampered stuff that we have in the provincial councils. And there's an idea about the international dimension of it. That gets sabotaged for several reasons, by the LTTE, but also by the UNP. And then in 2001, there are three actors that have one shared interest. Ranil Wickremesinghe, the Norwegians, and the LTTE. What's their shared interest? They're fed up with Chandrika. So LTTE doesn't trust her and worry about her taking over militarily. Ranil Wickremesinghe has won as a prime minister, but is very weak, so he needs to do something to put her on the sidelines. And the Norwegians have fallen out with her because they have disclosed, she has disclosed their role, and they're sort of worried about what to do. They press on, and Chandrika wants them out. So they're like, Solheim was also not a completely innocent character. So they want to do something. So we have these three actors that have a very superficial convergence of interest. Do something with peace to keep Chandrika in the side. That convergence allows the ceasefire. It allows the first round of talks, but there's no view on what those talks would be about and what the outcome would be. And the moment that becomes an issue, third round of talks in Oslo, the whole thing falls apart. So from this perspective, there never really was a peace process in the way that people describe it. The real stuff happened before. It could have worked had things played out differently. And what is called the peace process is really the crumbling of the attempt at peace that preceded it. Yeah, sorry, I got carried away, but I think that's an important thing because it's often misunderstood.
Yes, that's great, because I did have a question on international actors, and I did want to probe a bit of that, and I think you provided that perspective. I did want to jump into chapter 6, because you did mention the kind of trajectory of Tamil nationalist politics, and of course it comes in various strands. And one of the strands that you kind of trace is the Tamil political parties and how they express their aspirations of what Tamil nationalism means in the early years after independence, and then how that shifts in the post-war context. And you kind of frame why the term post-war is also a lauded term. And you introduce this concept of, again, not yourself, but I'm sure it's in the literature, this concept of anti-politics. And I found that really interesting because I could see certain links with some of the previous chapters, and I was asking the question, okay, what constitutes as anti-politics? In the previous chapter, you were talking about the Northeastern Provincial Council and how some of the bureaucrats were deploying techniques of technocracy or bureaucraticism in order to distance themselves from the power politics that was unleashed in the post-war context. And so this question was in my head, okay, does that constitute as anti-politics? And how would you describe anti-politics, and what would you say to that?
Right. I don't mind the combination that you made, but I see the two as slightly different. So the Northern Provincial Council, particularly the bureaucrats, so of course the elected council, it becomes a different story later. During the war, collaborated with both government and LTTE, which was complicated, and they did that by rendering technical. We're just following their procedure. They're hiding behind a sort of smokescreen of bureaucracy to do the basic things that they had to do. Not for some sinister political motive, but just to survive as a bureaucracy in an environment that was super complicated and dangerous. So you could call that anti-political, but it's not the sort of main thing that I think of when I call anti-politics. Anti-politics is a term that Thomas Hansen, others have used in relation to Shiv Sena, sort of the early moments of the Hindutva movement, where there are spaces that aren't presented as political because politics is dirty and corrupt and problematic, but this is about culture, it's about religion, it's about community, these kinds of things. So you create a space that is presented and framed as the opposite of politics or outside of politics, but which in fact has, of course, political implications. So the very act of calling something anti-political is itself, of course, political. So there's always that double bind in the term. But it's a useful term to think with because quite often there is these workarounds, these spaces that people create to confront political issues that they grapple with, but not in the sort of standard democratic arena in which they can do that. And often, particularly for separatists or for other revolutionaries for whom the democratic arena as it exists doesn't afford them the space that they have. So if you are an Aboriginal activist in Australia, or if you are a Catalan nationalist in Spain, you can vote and you can participate in democracy, but the thing that you want is effectively illegal. It's ruled out of bounds. So then other spaces open up. The Aboriginal activist opened a tent in Canberra that was their embassy in relation to the Australian occupier. Yeah, that's technically not political because it's not the official politics, but it's a form of anti-politics. What happens in Catalonia with cultural repertoires, but also with the football clubs, FC Barcelona, becomes, it's not a political space. You can't sort of accuse a football club for doing the wrong kind of politics, but of course it becomes a political space to express certain things. That's also true for the Tamil movement in Sri Lanka. When the democratic arena doesn't allow them to do what they want to do, there are other ways in which you can make your point, to do with religion, also to do with the history. So the SJV Chalvanayaka Memorial in Jaffna has an annual ceremony. It's a place that people go to. It's like a pilgrimage site of sorts. Now, that place and the things that people do in that place are not technically political in the sense that it's an official expression of politics, but of course they're highly politicized spaces. And in the name of the memorial event, which is a person and paying tribute, and you wouldn't want to spoil that, but politicize that. But of course, it's highly political as a moment, a sort of key founding father of Tamil nationalism, but also a key site of Tamil nationalism there in Jaffna, across from the library, right across the Alfred Durjampa football stadium, the Dutch fort, and all these places have a very loaded history. So it's a space of politics that is presented to be sort of different outside, and yet it allows to do all kinds of things. And in the center, the way I use that concept in that chapter that you refer to, which is the last empirical chapter of the book, about Tamil political parties, the parliamentarians and provincial councillors after the war, is that they use these repertoires of anti-politics to still be nationalist, even if the democratic system forecloses that kind of space. So that's right. The basic logic there.
Yes, and in terms of some of the examples, if I'm correct in interpreting it, you kind of categorize some examples of anti-politics, such as electoral boycotts and hartals. And am I correct in understanding that another form of it was in the ITAC's approach towards the Northern Provincial Council, in the sense that, so again quoting you, that the participation of the ITAC in the Northern Provincial Councils was not meant to legitimize the councils, but to expose its inadequacies. Would you say that was part of the repertoire of anti-politics?
For sure. So in that chapter, of course, one needs to simplify and categorize certain things. So I basically argue there are three main repertoires in the Tamil nationalist movement, earlier, during the war, but also after the war. One is article of faith politics. So it's like expression of grievance. We are here. So that some of the diaspora referendum goes in that category. It doesn't make any difference legally, but it's an expression of, we have our grievances. Voting for ITAC, many Tamils always did that with very low expectations. It wasn't going to change anything. They weren't going to give them schools and roads like other politicians do. But it's a way of saying, I am a Tamil citizen, we are here. So it's an article of faith, just because. The second repertoire is political abstinence. So boycotts, to some degree, hardtails go in that, by participating, by not participating. And of course, the Tamil nationalist movement has a very uneven record of that. They're not very systematic. They've never boycotted, to my memory, the parliamentary elections. They've boycotted local elections. They've boycotted provincial elections because they thought the provincial councils were itself, a scam and in the employ to sabotage the cause. But they've sometimes boycotted presidential elections. I'm trying to remember. So they're very uneven in that. But basically, an electoral boycott is a form of anti-politics. You say, I'm out, but at the same time, by doing that, you're of course in. And the third repertoire, which is in some ways the most interesting, to some degree, funny, but also not funny, repertoire is the performance of deficiency. So when the Northern Provincial Council finally was allowed to function, elections were allowed to happen. So here we're in 2010, from the top of my head. So long time after they were created. And the main Tamil parties had always said that the provincial councils are the wrong thing. They're treason to the cause, and therefore we don't participate. Also because the LTTE, of course, was against. Now they realized, okay, there's no way. If we are going to boycott this is the chance to rule the Northern Province, which is 90-something% Tamil. If we don't rule, somebody else will do it. And one of these, rowdies or low caste or otherwise opponent parties will rule. So we have to participate. So they govern the Northern Provincial Council. And normally when Sri Lankan politicians get elected, and I think it's not that different in other Asian countries, they make themselves bigger than they are. I can do anything, look at me. They start cutting ribbons and opening roads and drive around in expensive vehicles. They show the potency of their institution, even if that's not always credible. The Tamil nationalists did the opposite. They ruled the council to show how useless it was. It started with Vigneswaram, who was elected chief minister. In his inaugural speech, he said, the provincial council is a leaky boat. It's not good for anything. And then during their time in office, of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit, they did some things, but a lot of things they didn't do, a lot of things they could have done or could have actually concretely made a difference for bread and butter issues in the north. They didn't really deliver on much of that. And at the same time, they passed God knows how many resolutions on things that the provincial council had no say on the genocide, on transparency, accountability, international involvement, peace process, all things that are not even on any list for the provincial council. So they were purely for the sake of saying it. So they performed the council to show how useless it was to a local audience, but particularly to an international audience, and to say, look, we have tried, this is clearly not working, and therefore a better solution is needed. Therefore, the international community needs to act. That was the basic thinking. So they enacted it as deficient with the aim of getting something better.
Right.
As to go performances, the question is what you try to enact and what people actually see and what the consequences are tend to be a bit different. So my conclusion in that chapter is, rather than proving the deficiency, the ineptitude of the provincial council, which is not completely without merit, they in fact demonstrated their own ineptitude, and many Tamil voters got completely fed up with the Tamil politicians who were just talking and not doing anything. So they performed their own deficiency as much as they performed that of the provincial council, and that, of course, was shown in subsequent electoral results.
So anti-politics as a strategy, you would say that it wasn't very effective in this instance because of the kind of internal politics that happens within the council.
Yeah, I think so. I think in this particular case, of course, the basic point was not without merit. Maybe some people also took that point, but the end result of it was, I think, counterproductive. Yeah.
Right. And another theme that comes up throughout the book is, especially in the latter chapters, is this idea of patronage politics and then the seeming tension. Of course, there's a lot of interlinkage between the two with nationalist politics. And I mean, in this repertoire of anti-politics, I did kind of hear a bit of that in the sense that even in the post-war context, the ITAC or the TNA would kind of insist on having this more unified narrative of what the Tamil nationalist aspirations were. and in doing so, kind of avoiding or preventing a more transformative social justice agenda, especially which could address other intra-Tamil issues such as caste and poverty on a class axis. And alongside this thought, there was also this very interesting anecdote that you had about Sambandhan, who was the leader of ITAC at the time, who was called as a temple MP, a temple member of parliament, because he was seen as someone who would return empty-handed, so not necessarily delivering these material goods. So I was just thinking of the two things alongside. And of course, patronage politics has kind of been a part of the Sri Lankan state in an ethnicized way. But of course, we also have a decolonial or post-colonial history in the sense that the state has always also been seen by certain sections of the people, of the masses, as having a moral responsibility to look after the people, to look after their material well-being. Again, a complicated question, but I just wanted to get a sense of how would you see this tension between the two? Is there really a tension? Is that overcome in certain ways? And you do kind of hint at some of these examples. And for how long would that prevent this kind of translation into a more transformative movement that moves beyond the Tamil nationalist aspirations?
That latter question adds a new layer. So yes, this basic tension between nationalist politics or ethno-nationalist politics and patronage politics is a really interesting one, because you can depict them as separate. Of course, in the end, they're also connected. But the basic logic is different, right? So many Sri Lankans, particularly among the Sinhalese community, who have access to politicians that can get powerful positions, patronage politics is very intuitive. Of course, there's also ideological politics. You are a sort of UNP or SLP or something else. For many people, that's quite deeply felt for ideological or other reasons. But at the same time, there's a certain degree of pragmatism of money flows where it needs to flow. And in the end, the question is not about grand ideological views and plans, but rather do we get a school? Do our kids get jobs? Do the roads function? Does the hospital have what it needs, etc., etc. So, and a lot of that translates into patronage, but becomes very practical in terms of politics, like whatever alliance works. And there's a very stark contrast between Muslim politics and Tamil politics in this regard. Both are minority communities with serious grievances, but the majority of Tamil politicians have taken a sort of principle stance and therefore have not been very effective in patronage. And many Muslim politicians have done the reverse. They've taken principle stance sometimes when they really can't avoid doing it, but in practice, they very often take sort of pragmatic alliances in order to let the money flow. And you can see the difference when you drive along the East Coast, that the good schools, the good hospitals, the new ones, that is very often in Muslim areas and not in Tamil areas. So these things make a difference. The fundamental question is, and both have a sort of degree of legitimacy, what is politics supposed to do? And many singular voters and also other voters and also politicians that I interviewed in Eastern Sri Lanka, for example, would say, well, look, ultimately, it's not about all these complicated structures and systems. We need to have something we need to divide the pie equally. So every district needs to have an MP that can cater for their people. In many other parts of the world, that's not how it works, but for Sri Lankans, this is the logical thing. So when I ask those people, what do you think about provincial councils? Like, it's fine. It could be something else. Ultimately, as long as every district gets something, then if it's through the council or through a national ministry or through the divisional secretariat, that doesn't really matter, as long as there is a person who can divide it up. But from a Tamil nationalist point of view, that's sabotage of the cause, because it isn't about dividing everything equally. It's about fundamental rights. It's about language. It's about being a citizen. It's about equality before the law. It's not about money. You also can't buy us with money. We have fundamental reasons. There's a historical grievance here that needs to be fixed. And therefore, we need not just a provincial council, but something more powerful that really, if not independent, at least bolsters a fundamental degree of autonomy. So there's shared sovereignty. Now, these are just different ways of looking at it, but they sabotage each other, right? It's not that these are not innocent repertoires. So when Premadasa, the president in the late 80s, created all these schemes and programs and ways of supporting local communities, that wasn't just because he felt so strongly about local communities. Maybe he did too. But it was also a way of making the Tamil narrative redundant.
Hmm.
Why would you need a provincial council? Let's have devolution at the lowest level because that's more effective. That's not just a statement of government efficiency. That's also sabotage to the Tamil issue, because by taking the unit of devolution to the municipality, you make it politically impotent. Because municipalities are not something that can rival against the state. When you move it up and you take the unit of devolution to be the north and east, it becomes politically potent. So these are not, they're sort of played in the language of development and subsidiarity and sort of efficient governance, which is also the language that the bureaucrats use. But behind that is a highly politicized battle between organizing the architecture of the state. And patronage in that regard is direct way to make ethno-nationalist claims look irrelevant and impotent. So there's always a sort of official debate which has merit and it's not completely insensible. That's how things work. And there's a sort of shadow debate that underlies that as well.
Right. I mean, I don't know to what extent you would agree, which is that whether this would explain the resonance of certain parties like the EPDP, sections of the SLFP, and now the NPP in certain in areas in the north and east to an extent. I don't know if you would agree.
Very interesting question. I mean, EPDP is a very separate story, of course. It has its own sort of constituency on the islands, its own place in the war landscape, its own linkages when it had no other options with the state and the military. And then also a little bit of patronage, but I think that's not the main thing explaining the protracted existence of the EPDP. The NPP, those are open questions to me. So I've not been back to Jaffna much. I was there just briefly last year, but I'm not enough to really know anything. There's a lot of talk around many of the Tamils voting for the NPP. Is this the terminus of Tamil politics? Is this finally the grasp that Tamil politicians have over their constituency, which have very loyal voters, has broken and it's bankrupt now. People want something else, and the NPP has given it to them. And of course, people are skeptical of that and saying, look, sometimes there's a protest vote, but it doesn't mean that suddenly Tamil nationalism is dead or that Tamils no longer care about these kinds of things. So that's an open question to me, but it's precisely about these kinds of issues so the jury is out, in my view. The NPP, like all governments, disappoint. That's what happens when you start running a country. But there's also, I think, it's not just a patronage outfit, right? Like who delivers stuff to the people. There's real thinking and real merit behind that movement. Doesn't come out of nowhere. So I think it actually opens up real interesting questions around. It opens real interesting space to confront the big issues that Sri Lanka has in democratic terms rather than ethnic terms. And that, I think, is highly productive, because the moment something becomes a Tamil claim, it becomes very difficult to accept it because it would be giving in to the Tamils. But when you frame the same thing as a civic claim, suddenly there's space to do very similar things in a very different way for everybody. So I think that's highly inspirational and hopeful in some ways. And at the same time, precisely because of that, I think there's a degree of skepticism from Tamil politicians, from Tamil nationalists, that they're buying into a frame that could threaten the more fundamental issues to them. And to what degree the NPP is not singular. The Prime Minister is an academic who's open to many of these issues. The President has a background that is, and a constituency that is a bit more singular nationalist. So where is this? And I think the jury is out on that. And I've not lost hope. But right. Many big steps are yet to be taken.
But also then this question of the political left within the Tamil nationalist movement. And so I did want to kind of pick your brain on that in terms of, like you said, there is this tension of nationalism with patronage politics. And of course, there is a history of suppression of our political left as well. But do you see that as something that is not able to kind of overcome the identity politics in the North, which is a very real existential threat? And I can understand why that has always been privileged. But what would be your take on it?
As a combination of the TULF with all its different units is a slightly different, broader outfit, if you like. Fundamentally, on a sort of level of political theory, you can do democracy with all the issues within that, and there's class and caste and social mobility and all these kinds of things. And there's a politics about demarcating the Tamils. But doing both at the same time is very difficult. So ITAC was always sort of shifting between the presenting itself as the government of the Tamil community in relation to others, like statesmen, and at the same time a political party within the Tamil community. Being both at the same time is very hard, because the one requires you to represent all Tamils towards an external enemy, friend, party, ally, and the other requires you to fight battles within Tamil society. Putting issues within Tamil society on the agenda is good if you compete against another Tamil party, but it's bad if you're trying to represent the whole Tamil nation. So playing the caste card or regional disparities between the north and the east or other parts of Sri Lanka, the question of the Muslims, social issues between the class questions, all these issues are important for Tamil politicians, at the same time threatening, because if your central idea is we are joined as a Tamil front and we have single demands towards the state, all these issues are going to complicate matters. Hindu Christian is another one that comes up. So this was a highly difficult thing. Of course, with the LTTE, all this was under the lid for the wrong reasons, of course, but it made Tamil politicians rather more singular and straightforward. When the LTTE were dead and the Tamil political arena opened up, this was rather more complicated, because suddenly you had to do both these things at the same time, which is really difficult. But also many of these Tamil politicians weren't used to that. They were all very old, right? Because no new politicians really came up in the 80s and the 90s. So these were all people in their 70s and 80s who had grown up with a very particular orthodoxy of Tamil nationalism, which wasn't about arguing local issues and distributional issues and caste issues and all these other things. It was about, the canon, the cardinal issues of Tamil nationalism. Timpu talks, they can rehearse the history day by day for you, right? But suddenly there were all these people in Jaffna who said, look, we are a disprivileged community, we still don't have water, we still don't have basic facilities. There were people in the east who's like, look, we are a minor Tamil community in Ampara district, but we need help. What have you got for us? Karuna came in, other kind of factions, different kind of opponents who were also Tamil nationalists, but opposed to them. This was very disorienting for them and very difficult. And they actually failed to really grapple with that in a productive manner. And to some degree, are still struggling with that. It's a positive thing, because it's the maturation, the sort of growing of Tamil national or Tamil democratic politics as a sort of fully mature phenomenon. There's an open arena where all kinds of things can be discussed and must be discussed. That's right. I mean, the gender issue, of course, also another one that is, to some degree, at least being played out, being put on the agenda. But the way Tamil leaders handle that and the way they confront these different forces is still crystallizing itself.
So in terms of the locations that you chose, how much of it was things that naturally happened and then you saw a pattern afterwards, or was it something that you consciously chose? So we have Sampur as a location, we have Trincomalee, the Northeastern Provincial Council, and then we have the Northern Provincial Council. How did that come about?
So this was a total headache, and it was a complete bricolage. So this was not a book that was written in a sort of pre-planned manner with a project proposal and a sound methodology, and we do this case and that case and that case, and then we have this, and then we execute it. That's not what happened. This is me as a master student being quite clueless about things, dropped into what was then still an active war zone, where those days as a European academic, even a junior academic, you could do quite a few things and get access to places. Walking away from Sri Lanka, coming back later, being involved in some background stuff around the peace process. Tsunami happened. Then a new academic project. I was interested in the provincial council because it seemed so important, but nobody ever talked about it and nobody knew much about it. So a whole bunch of things sort of started collating. And then I tried to write a book, and I made the mistake that I think many novice book writers make, of thinking, well, but this has to be in, and this has to be true. I write the comprehensive history of conflict in Sri Lanka. Several of those books exist. In my view, most of them are not very good, because it's about everything. And I really struggled to say, how do you keep this big story together? Because my analysis covers different kind of levels, and that's the point. And at the same time, stick to the things that you actually know something about. So in my first draft, I had a whole chapter about the IPKF and the Indian involvement in Sri Lanka. But I had no, like, I wasn't there. I don't have any privileged data. What I have is basically stuff that I've read. So I'm recycling it. So I ended up chucking most of that out. There were other things that I tried to be, this also, you can't ignore this, you can't, what about the upcountry? So I ended up writing this massive book that had very varied levels of depth and quality, which was useless. And it got chucked out, and the reviewers, first at Stanford and at Cambridge, were brutal, but for a good reason. And I ended up having to recompose it. And then I thought, okay, so I have a consistent analytical thread now, which is about the performative forms of Tamil politics, which is helpful in the 70s, it's helpful in the 80s and 90s, it's helpful in the post-war era as well. So it actually gives me a thoroughgoing thread. And I have a few places that I know really well. Sampur was a place that I did my very first research in 2000, but I kept coming back to again and again and again. So I have a sort of long durée set of issues that I can take traction on. So I have a degree of depth. Jaffna is really important. I had much less depth there, but I had sort of key moments, for example, the provincial council elections, some of the wartime stuff. So I could at least anchor that properly. Then I had stuff around the peace process. We were asked to do the evaluation for the Norwegian intervention by Norway itself. So we had access to all the archives. We had Norwegian colleagues digging through the notes that all the diplomats and bureaucrats made in Oslo at the time. So that was something that I wanted to bring in. So there were a few things that I could level together. Then I did some ethnographic work in the provincial council, mainly in the east, in Trinco, but a little bit in the north as well, by a whole bunch of interviews. So I realized, okay, I can piece this together. And I think that's worked. I think it's made the book very rich, because you move from highly local stuff in Sampur to sort of regional stuff in the provincial council, to the stuff around the peace process with interviews and observations in Colombo and Jaffna, and then some of the international stuff. We interviewed very senior diplomats in Delhi, in ministers, others, Kumara Tunga herself. So there was sort of macro international stuff as well. Yeah. But the book, and some of the reviewers have picked up on that, of course, also jumps over things. So there are gaps between. There's all kinds of things that aren't in the book. And this, I think, has been the interesting thing about writing the book. Can you write a compelling story by selecting the interesting kind of places without trying to fill all the space in between? Because I think it wouldn't necessarily have made a better book if I had done all the other spaces too. I think in some ways it would have made it more tedious. Right. But yeah, so that wasn't the long answer is, just the short answer of this long summary is that there wasn't a methodological choice. It's how it grew. And then when I sit back in 2019 or so to try and put all this together in a slightly inefficient manner, I ended up concluding I can write a credible and coherent story by reusing these bits that I have. Right.
I mean, that's really interesting, because for someone who doesn't know the backstory, I thought it was quite a cleverly crafted methodology.
I managed to perform authorship to you in a credible manner.
Yes, and there were these conceptual tools that you deployed, and some methodological tools such as tracing how a particular statute would follow, that I thought were very interesting and useful for anyone who was trying to kind of map this long duration kind of study. And so now we are in chapter 5 in terms of the question that I wanted to ask you, which is the Eastern Tourism Bureau Statute, which is this statute that you kind of trace, and which shows the complexities of the bureaucracy, but also in terms of its negotiation, asymmetrical negotiation with the central government. And this is the time of Mahinda Rajapaksa. He deploys, in terms of the UDA under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the ministry under Basil, as well as the military prowess. And so I thought this was a really rich kind of demonstration of how certain kind of lawmaking gets expedited when there is a Western interest behind it. And then you kind of speak about this transition in 2015, when Austin Fernando comes into power as the governor, Sirisena as the president. It's a more accommodating government. And the Bureau does end up with compromised powers, but at the same time, also this sentiment of at least they got this done. And so my question was really, in your sense, how did you perceive this?
No, I thought it as a tragedy, really, as a sign of how things end up. So statutes are laws. Many people don't know this, but provincial councils are different from any other level of government except parliament, in the sense that they're constitutionally empowered to create law. They don't just do stuff that other people tell them to do. They can create their own laws, and they can therefore push back against the center. In practice, of course, this has been framed and sabotaged and constrained in all kinds of manners. But legally speaking, they have the power to make law, statute. A provincial law is called a statute. Now, if you interview people about this, you get some pretty straightforward answers that, in practice, this power is highly curtailed. But I, as an academic, I wanted to, let's see, let's try, let's actually study this. So I went into the archives in Trinco, where you had these very, no offense to anybody, but quite shoddy folders with lots of paper and bit here, bit there. But it wasn't super organized. But I could trace not just the final statute, but all the versions that had been there. And I spoke, of course, to the people in the legal unit and people in the different, the people who were responsible for tourism. And there were, I can't remember how many, but in the north there were more. In the east there were something like 10 statutes that were eventually passed and a whole bunch that were tried. And so I actually traced all of these and then selected a few that I studied in depth, like what was the initial version, and it was a beautiful exercise. And there's something beautiful about bureaucracy and how it works, of what actually happened to that text. And the conclusion is, in my view, the short answer to that question, that these powers are highly constrained. What the provinces can actually do is really not very much. But the more interesting story is, let's look at the bureaucracy in the same field as the militancy. So what the LTTE tried to do militarily, in some ways, is what the politicians and the bureaucrats try to do with the pen. If these are not separate spaces. They're contesting sovereignty in a different way. And then an interesting thing happens too. So ultimately, the provincial statute about tourism isn't just about tourism, it's about claiming sovereignty. So in the initial version, it empowered the province powers over land, powers over law. So it allowed them to kick out some of the tourism zones that made these megalomaniac boutique hotels that were just benefiting rich people in Colombo, but not the local communities. So to be able to stop those, to be able to tax them, so land, tax, and sort of governing powers to evict people if you wanted them. Those are sovereign qualities, right? That's not to do with tourism a little bit, but really about the sovereign power of control over land, control over tax, control over force. And if you sort of look at the different ways in this, the statute travels and it goes to Colombo, and then there are some very vague assertions, there's elections, and what eventually comes out is the same statute with just those things taken out. So they can tax hotels, provided they're hotels with no more than 5 rooms. Okay, small insertion, but it makes it completely impotent, right? All the big hotels could become out of grasp, and the ones that you can tax are your local hostels with, that don't earn any money anyway. Your power to evict people who are not using the land properly gets boiled down to you can issue a notice to the central government. So you can inform the central government that something's wrong, but the central government is doing it, so there's no point noticing them. So there's all these tiny little bureaucratic insertions that get added in, and the end result of it is that this claim to some sort of sovereign power that the provincial council wanted to have gets completely watered down. So we have a tourism bureau and a budget, but it's all empty shells, and it becomes a completely impotent thing, which is a tragedy for 2 reasons. One, the Eastern Province has massive tourism potential. It would actually, could thrive on this. You could make money on this. It could be good for the province when done right, in terms of ecology and in terms of people, etc. And secondly, it could give some credence to the provincial council system as a genuine form of power sharing, as a genuine form of devolution, which would be good for principal reasons and for other reasons. But certainly at that time, neither of those things materialized. Whether under the present discussion, of course, the provincial councils have been on hold indefinitely. We're waiting for the right kind of reforms and for a new lease of life. Hopefully, something could come out, and then it could be different. But for now, the conclusion is we have the provincial council system at the moment are a system that nobody wanted, except India, and a system that is on a sort of objective scale good for nothing. Like from a political perspective, it's impotent. From a governance perspective, it's useless. But it could be useful and it could be potent if it was changed in the right kind of way.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that came up in the book, that on the persistence of these institutions, as highly political as they are, as highly contested as they are, and as highly inefficient as they are, they kind of persist in in having relevance to an extent. My last question is on the empirical chapters, is really about Sampur. So we're going to chapter 4 now. And again, I thought this was a fascinating chapter, just in terms of the richness of the detail. You kind of speak about why Sampur functions on the one hand as a pure Tamil space in terms of its ethnic composition, and then over time gets depicted as this Tamil free space. And then you also speak about some of the intra-Tamil issues that come up during this time in terms of the IDPs being reluctant to being relocated to an area that does not perhaps have the caste purity as well as certain livelihoods that they are accustomed to, which is the agricultural livelihoods. And I mean, there's a lot, of course, that I'm sure that you can say about why you chose this space, as well as some of these dynamics that I just mentioned. But I specifically also wanted to ask you, so after the people were forced into the displacement camp and a high security zone was established, you said that you record that some of the residents go and challenge this at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then leads to a judgment where the government reduces the sign and rebrands it as a special economic zone. And this kind of triggered my curiosity in terms of the intricacies of capital and violence. I understand this book is trying to cover a lot of ground, but I just wondered if you had any particular thoughts that you could not put into this book in terms of how capital functioned, how the special economic zone functioned in middle of all of this complexity.
So like I said, this book was written not in the most efficient manner. So there was a phase where I was studying Sampur, which had then been declared a special economic zone, first being a high security zone, the net effect being the same in the sense that nobody was allowed in and all the people were displaced. And I then ended up reading about special economic zones, which of course are highly common in South Asia and Southeast Asia as well. And there's, to some degree, literature on that I didn't find very interesting. You know, there are economic instruments, blah, blah, blah. Tax havens or tax cuts and tariffs and these kind of things. But there were also some really interesting analysis about what really goes on. Like Iwa Ong and Jamie Cross, I think his name, and writes on that. Iwa Ong on Malaysia and Jamie Cross on different zones in India, and there's others, of course, about what is it really a sort of sovereign exemption or is it not? Like what is actually going on? And there are very different forms of special economic zones. Just the Chinese economic zones around the sort of satellite states or border areas in its neighborhood. There's many different formations, there's many different variations of special economic zones for very different kind of purposes. The truth is, I think that Sampur in many ways never really became anything that resembles a normal economic zone. There was talk about a power plant, there was talk about a harbor, about industries. None of that ever came off the ground. It was a military installation straight from the start. And there were talk about factories. None of that was ever built there. There were some things that happened in other areas, some to some degree with good results. But Sampur was only ever a massive debate around special economic zones, but it never really became one. And therefore, I don't think it's a useful example in sort of capital and violence because the capital never came, and the violence was always there. But it raises interesting questions about how exempting a particular territory from a particular set of laws can serve all kinds of purposes. Land appropriation, sovereign erasure in this case, the whole LTTE project got violently erased, but also capital capture and, very unequal forms of capital accumulation that can happen through special economic zones. So there's the kind of labor laws that get suspended. And so there's a big debate about special economic zones. And in some ways, Sampur was in some ways the most extreme or an outlying example that shows certain things, but not many others. Right. So to think if I studied special economic zones, I probably wouldn't pick Sampur as a logical case study, just because it is so unusual, so anomalous, and first and foremost framed as a special economic zone to give it a glance of political legitimacy, and sort of project then Rajapaksa government dreams of becoming a new Singapore or Malaysia with all modernity and infrastructure and all these things, which failed elsewhere. I mean, the port city, Hambantota, they're picking up the pieces now. In Sampur, it never even started.
And you define Sampur as the beginning of the end. Is that correct? Yes. So in terms of the context of the war, yes.
So that's the 2006 military invasion, when the government military reconquers Sampur. As somebody who studied Sampur in some detail, this was of course of interest to me. Not many other people know too much about Sampur or put too much importance on it. But reasoning backwards, which is always a tricky thing to do, in some ways the resumption of the war after the peace process in the 2000s really started in Sampur. That's where the first military land offensives took place. And it ended, of course, in Mulevaiko 3 years later. And when I was sort of going through this material, which is, as you hinted at the very start, is not a happy story. There's a lot of traumatic stuff in there. But I realized that a lot of the big things around the Vani and the end of the war maybe shouldn't have been a surprise to us, because many of the basic tenets of that happened in Sampur in a smaller way. So getting the internationals out, the whole barrage of completely overpowering military force, irrespective of civilian presence, forcing people out, erasing the whole land, and then claiming it in a sort of highly militarized way with a slight dimension of reconstruction, but a very particular version of reconstruction, and sort of symbolic claims to the land with particular monuments and these kinds of things. All those things happened later in the north, in a bigger and much more problematic way. But in some ways, the basic version of that was already there in Sampur, and then when they pushed south to Vagara, to Batikalo. So therefore, if Mulevaiko, the 2009 defeat of the LTD, the victory of the government, among many Tamils, the end as a sort of phrase that is used for that moment, then in some ways Sampur was the beginning of the end, because that's in some ways where the end started.
To get a sense, Bart, of the kind of social, to a sense, complicity or negotiation of some of the dynamics that we're describing here. So I'm reminded of in one of the chapters where you're talking about how the LTT exercises a degree of tactical restraint in some of its engagement at the ground level, because it wants to have this level of legitimacy among the community, especially in instances where it does not have to necessarily enforce coercion. And in the Sampur chapter, I'm seeing through your ethnography a lot of the intra-Tamil politics or intra-Tamil divisions that come out, such as across caste and all of that. How much of that did you feel was performance? Again, I have a bit of this question of how much is performance, and then how much of it is kind of like a more struggle for survival or to make sense of a life that is subject to a lot of violence, a lot of displacement. Do you see a kind of tension?
It's also the latter, of course, struggle across the board, and violence and suffering and all that. But it's also, analytically speaking, relevant for a performative perspective because it disrupts. So the narrative of Tamil National was a very sort of singular, or at least an attempt at that narrative of cohesion. We have differences, but in the end, we are all Tamil, and Tamil is the defining feature. And then when the inhabitants of Sampur finally returned to Sampur after the war, after being violently displaced, after a long struggle with the government and in displacement camps of having the lands back, they get their land back, and of course it's being completely erased, and they have to start completely from scratch. So the return itself is traumatic. But they rebuilt, and Sampur is there. There's a Tamil space again. It was a pure Tamil space. That's of course a discursive claim. It was a Tamil free space when it was a closed zone, and now it's a Tamil space once more. And when you talk to people then, of course, there was traumas, there was a disorientation, there was a degree of happiness of being back, and the fields growing again, and the rice, etc. The temple, of course, got rebuilt quickly. But a lot of the talk was also this complete sense of disorientation. Like, we are Tamil here, this is a Tamil place, we can be Tamil, but at the same time, nobody quite knows what that means anymore. Like, because we used to be Tamil in a particular way, but now the youth are smoking, and certainly the poorer Hindus have now gone to evangelical churches. Even the language has changed. Caste issues are not being observed. People marry in all kinds of ways. So all the things that defined us as Tamil, to do with traditional forms, to do with clothing, to do with temples and religion, to do with caste, to do with language, to do with a certain way of respect for elderly people, etc., etc. All these things have slipped between their fingers and it's gone. So they feel a sense of loss, not just in terms of the violence of the war, but also of what it's done to their struggle to being Tamil. And this disorientation I thought was really profound. Of course, not completely surprising, but profound. And it's really interesting because a lot of the post-war stuff focuses on the formal destruction and the formal rights, but this sort of more innate sense of loss escapes that analysis often. But it also has political implications because politicians representing Tamilness, of course, then also have to relate to that. And the question of caste comes back in. LTTE never succeeded in making that irrelevant or suppressing that. Other issues come in. So, of course, high caste people are, some of them at least, are trying to reclaim those positions, but then they fail. And then there's a whole sense of the whole, we're all singular now, is what somebody said. Like there's no the sense of Tamil cohesion that we have is completely gone because everybody's doing their own thing. Everybody's a leader now. Which, of course, is a narrative that you can find in many other parts of the world. Is a narrative of sort of anti-globalization or youth conduct that you can find in the suburbs of Paris or in villages in South Africa, I'm sure. But it's also distinctly post-war related because there's this sense of post-war disorientation and what does it now mean to be Tamil? What defines us as Tamils and what are the political implications of that?
Did you come to some great realization in the writing of this book on sovereignty? Has it fundamentally changed your approach to it, or are you equally confused at the end of writing this book?
A little bit. So sovereignty is a very slippery term. We often use it as a placeholder concept that's sort of supposed to be clear. Like states are sovereign, or a nation, national people are sovereign, and it's sort of a Wilsonian, a right to self-determination, these kind of things. Non-interference, of course, these days, all these things are also being challenged globally, but that used to be a sort of clear hallmark of things. Of course, you dig in more deeper, sovereignty becomes rather more complicated. Historically, it's not just the quality of states, but also of kings and of gods and these kinds of things. Practically, it's about the ability to impose rules and enforce them, which is something that states do, but sometimes fail to do. And other actors sometimes do a lot like states. We talked about special economic zones. There are private companies that have these kind of qualities, but also sometimes religious players or militants, rebel movements, Naxalites, de facto states. So it becomes a more slippery thing. And ultimately, of course, it depends on where you go with this, but if you go down the route of Schmid, Agam, and others, it's caught up with violence and with the ability not to make rules, but to break the rules, to suspend the rules, which is somehow always there, particularly with the LTTE. Now, then, if you move to the question of shared sovereignty, which of course is a sort of sensible way to go, if you look at a thing like the Tamil nationalist movement or other conflicts with some similarities, then shared sovereignty seems like a reasonable middle ground. But can there be shared sovereignty? Like, what can you share can you devise rules for sharing a kind of power that is defined as the ability to break the rules? Can you make rules for breaking the rules? So it becomes this really difficult to sort of fickle, capricious quality that is somehow problematic. And this was of course always there in the negotiation between the Sri Lankan state and the Tamil movement. That if the interim self-governing authority, the proposal of the LTTE in 2007 or something like that, create a sort of new escalation mechanism to the international arena because they didn't want the buck to stop at the Sri Lankan court, which would eventually favor the state. So who's the arbiter of contestations over sovereignty if you have shared sovereignty? This becomes a really complicated question, but I think ultimately we shouldn't buy into that sort of radicalism and say, okay, there are states that have different forms there are federal states like Germany or the United States or confederal ones like Switzerland, where sovereignty isn't singularly defined in a national people, but has a more layered quality. Plurinational states in some of the experiments that have existed in South America. If you look at Sri Lankan history, does it have to be the European single colonial idea of one state, one people, which is a very particular perspective on the world? Or can we recognize that the Sri Lankan society is a more complicated one with Sinhalese, Muslims, Tamils, and others, but maybe also within that. And that forces us to make this ultimately a discussion about rights, fundamental rights, about democratic values, rather than dividing up the state and whoever has his piece can do whatever the hell they want with it, which of course could be a very cynical form of sharing sovereignty. If the LTD had gotten its own state or its own unit, what kind of a place would that have been? It wouldn't have been a democratic paradise, right? So it would have solved some issues, but created new ones. So isn't it a deeper conversation about some balance between recognizing regional and ethnic community? So I think the Tamil claim to nationalism is not without merit. I think there is truth to that, legitimacy to that. And at the same time, if that means a sellout for everybody else to Tamil extremism, I'm not in favor of that. So can we frame shared sovereignty in more fundamental terms of saying we recognize that the sovereignty of the state, the sovereignty of political authority, of lawmaking in Sri Lanka hinges in a more complex manner, not just in one uniform national people, but between ethno-religious communities, regional communities perhaps, and can we devise fundamental principles, a bit of rights, human rights, democratic values, to police disagreements that could exist between these.
Well, on that
that's a very idealistic way to look, but I think from a theoretical point, that's where I would be leaning.
It's a good place to start from. Yes. Well, thank you, Bart, very much for this conversation.
Thank you for the interest. A very enjoyable discussion. Very good questions. Thank you.
You were listening to ISA's Bookshelf. We were chatting with Dr. Bart Klem, who is author of the book, Performing Sovereign Aspirations, Tamil Insurgency and Postwar Transition in Sri Lanka. Thanks to Devyani, Yusuf, and Harpreet for putting this podcast together. To learn more about ISAS, please visit our website or find us on social media. We will return next month with a new book to discuss. Thank you.